sessions that we have at this year's IGF. It's trying to address the concern of how do we protect and ensure access to internet infrastructure and core internet resources in context of conflict, crisis, and disasters. We're going to explore this session from the perspective of what the impact is on ordinary people, on communities, when internet infrastructure is destroyed or becomes unavailable. And we're going to look at what are the norms. Are there norms? Are there normative frameworks for responding or preventing this from happening? And then we're also going to look at what are the alternatives, what measures can be taken, what actions can be taken to get this multi-stakeholder community to play the role that it is usually so fundamentally committed to, which is to ensure an open, free, interoperable internet for everyone. And then finally, we will look at future-oriented actions. Where are the gaps? Are there gaps at the normative level? Are there gaps at the implementation level? And what can the IGF do? So I'm balancing too many devices here. To introduce you to my panel, and then I'm also going to introduce you to my fellow moderator, which is Peter Mitchell from Access Now, who's joining us from New York. I can hear an echo. Can everyone hear the echo? Is there anything we can do about the echo? Should I hold the mic further away? That helps. That helps. Peter Mitchell will join us from New York, and he'll make some opening remarks. But I first wanted to introduce you to my panel. So starting immediately from my left, we have Mohammed Sharif, who's currently with the private sector in a company called Oxica that works with cybersecurity. He's based in the Maldives, but he's previously been a Minister of State for Digital and Communications in the Maldives. Next to him, we have Ambassador Alan Snoerman, the Cyber Ambassador of the Netherlands. And next to him, I'm very pleased and proud to have my compatriot, Ms. Cynthia Lesufi, who's Minister Councillor in the South African Mission in Geneva, and she's also the International Telecommunications Union Council Working Group Chair for the World Summit on the Information Society and the Sustainable Development Goals. Next to Cynthia, we have Lama Faki from Human Rights Watch, who leads their work. She's the Director of Middle East and North Africa work at Human Rights Watch. And next to Lama, we have Kojo Boakye, who is the Meta Vice President for Policy for Africa and the Middle East. And then joining us online, we have from Palestine, Nadim Nassif, Executive Director of Hamle, the Arab Center for Social Media Advancement. And also joining us online is Professor Madeleine Carr. Is Madeleine with us already? Good, I can't see her on the screen. And Madeleine is Professor of Global Politics and Cybersecurity at University College London. To get us welcome, Peter and Nadim and Madeleine and everyone else who's with us online. Peter, do you want to start us off with some of the reflections and talking points that we feel we should try and address in this session?
Awesome. I share your excitement and agree it's a crucially important session. I'm excited to explore this intersection of connectivity, infrastructure, and instability, and how they relate to peace, development, and sustainability. It's core to the work of my organization, Access Now, and my teaching at Columbia University. Taking this beyond, to start, the context of internet governance, but to sustainable development broadly, we have sobering new facts. The Global Multidimensional Poverty Index, published by UNDP in Oxford in October,
Peter,
1.1 billion people.
Just pause a little bit. We have an audio issue. Can our tech support team please help? Peter, try speaking again. Let's test if it works.
Maybe if I turn off the mic.
Go ahead, speak. I don't think we can hear you right now. Can you hear me? Nod if you can hear me. Okay, try speaking. We can't hear you. My MAG colleagues here who helped organize this session, can you just check and help us fix this? Okay, I think while... Peter, let's try once more. Try speaking again.
So, as I was saying,
It's working.
The multi-dimensional poverty index by UNDP in Oxford found that 1.1 billion people are living in acute poverty, and a staggering 455 million of them are in countries experiencing war or fragility. So that's nearly half of people in acute poverty are experiencing war, and these conflicts have intensified and multiplied, creating widespread disruptions to lives and livelihoods, according to UNDP.
Selon le PNUD.
The poverty reduction tends to slow in these conflict-affected regions, where, incidentally, access to electricity is seeing higher deprivation. So you're lacking electricity, you're in extreme poverty, and you're suffering war and conflict. In this situation, the foundational infrastructure of electricity, again, is hard to come by, and that's going to affect what the infrastructure that we're talking about today of internet infrastructure and digital. So this is not a strong foundation to provide access. Unfortunately, we have to add climate change. Climate-related natural disasters intersect with poverty and conflict in ways that exacerbate disruption of infrastructure. Think of direct damage from violent storms to stress from extreme weather like heat and wildfires that take out telecom infrastructure, towers, overhead wires, and even cables. At these times, information is key to saving lives and directing humanitarian relief. Yet, heaped upon this deprivation, we have policy decisions. These don't always go in the right direction. In 2023, last year, the Keep It On coalition that my organization leads documented the highest number of internet shutdowns. These internet shutdowns occurred in 39 countries. These internet shutdowns are intentional disruptions, and unfortunately, it looks like 2024 saw even higher numbers than 2023. Despite states in the Global Digital Compact saying we must, quote, refrain from internet shutdowns and measures that target internet access. So, with all of these problems, what do? In response, we attempt to mitigate. We scramble to create fixes and workarounds through technological innovation. Public and private donors devote energy and resources to whip up networks in dire conditions, while humanitarian actors increasingly relying on digital, say cloud-based systems or biometric solutions, remote delivery platforms and communications channels, these humanitarian actors have really automated a lot of their systems and again rely on digital to do their work. They are, just like we are, looking to these technical fixes, whether it's satellite internet or joining emergency telecommunications clusters to provide quick import of hardware and assets, and seeking unlikely partnerships across all industries in real time. This is tough work and it's a scramble, so there has to be a better way, right? All of our societal systems rely in some way on connectivity and electricity. We recognize the sheer and growing importance of connectivity in civilian life, and perhaps more so when everything around you is engulfed in violence and war. I want to put out there that we need to focus on connectivity and providing it and protecting that infrastructure because it's a lot harder to bring back, and these Sisyphean efforts in the moment of crisis encounter a lot of trouble. So let's start by looking at first principles and in addition to the reactive workarounds that we've all been putting together. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Peter. I want to check French translation sorted out now. There were issues with the French interpretation. So I'm assuming that it is okay. I'm just checking on the Zoom to see if it is. And it looks now they cannot hear me. I'm not audible. Apparently, the Zoom participants say that they cannot hear me. No audio for Zoom. I can't see the tech team. Who's doing the Zoom? Can you hear me through the headsets? People in the room can hear me. No one can hear me on remote. You still can't hear me? No. Sorry, Peace, can you please try and find someone who's dealing with the Zoom and sort this problem out? Thank you. The Zoom participants have lost audio completely. Oh, it's back. It's back. Peace, it's fine. It's back. I think it's back now. Good. So let's look at what the impacts are. So Lama, I want you to start. When we talk about these disruptions and the destruction of infrastructure or the interference of infrastructure or damage, what does this actually mean for people on the ground, for ordinary citizens, for civilians, for communities?
Thank you. I hope everyone can hear me well. During times of conflict, civilians, journalists, first responders...
Sorry, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but no, the Zoom audio problem has not been sorted out. So we'll continue, but please can we have our virtual participants able to hear the session? Can you see the transcript? Nadim and Peter, can you see the captioning? Just nod if you are able to. Oh, you can't hear me, so let's go ahead, Lama, I'll type.
Thank you. So as I was saying, during times of conflict, civilians, journalists, first responders, they rely on the internet to document and share evidence of abuse and to provide life-saving assistance. During times of political crisis, protesters leverage the internet to organize online and to stand up for their rights. And yet, time and again, we have seen states and armed groups take action to deliberately shut down access and to destroy telecommunication systems in ways that violate people's rights. In conflicts, as Peter was laying out, there may be multiple causes of these disruptions to communications networks, and they are sometimes deployed in tandem. Palestinians in Gaza have endured over a year of ongoing phone and internet disruption as a result of relentless airstrikes by the Israeli government and other actions that the government has taken. These actions have included damage to core communication infrastructure, cuts to electricity, fuel blockades, and apparently deliberate shutdowns through technical means. According to UN OCHA, on October 10, airstrikes conducted by the Israeli military targeted several telecommunications installations, destroyed 2 of 3 main lines for mobile communication, and this left residents in Gaza reliant on just 1 line for mobile and internet connectivity. it resulted in disruptions to services. And on October 27, at the start of Israel's ground incursion into Gaza, the connectivity came to a grinding halt during an approximately 34-hour communications blackout. Paltel, one of the few remaining service providers that is still operational in Gaza, confirmed to Human Rights Watch in November of 2023 that when service was restored without their intervention, it was clear that the disruptions were intentional. In times of conflict, authorities and armed groups should refrain from deliberately shutting down or destroying telecoms infrastructures because of the disproportionate harm that it has on civilians. When governments and armed groups target the infrastructure, they often justify these measures as necessary for public safety, curbing the spread of misinformation or for legitimate military reasons. But such sweeping measures are more like collective punishment. When the internet is off, people's ability to express themselves is limited. The economy suffers. Journalists are not able to upload evidence of abuses that they are documenting. Students are cut off from their lessons. Taxes can't be paid. And those needing health care often cannot access life-saving assistance. When India blocked access to the internet in Kashmir for months in late 2019, Indian officials justified the action by saying it was necessary to temporarily limit access to the internet during the period of crisis to avoid permanent loss of life. 4 UN special rapporteurs condemned the move, however, warning that the shutdown in Kashmir was inconsistent with the norms of necessity and proportionality. In other words, inconsistent with the law. Practically, at least one study by a researcher at the Stanford Global Digital Policy Incubator has found that shutdowns are actually counterproductive to deterring violent incidents. It tracked a quadrupling of violence when networks were disrupted as compared to cases when the internet stayed on. Shutdowns, they draw headlines, but subtler, equally devastating techniques to manipulate the internet deserve attention too. Authorities possess an arsenal ranging from blocking specific social media applications or messaging applications to throttling traffic to restricting live streaming. And these are all the types of weapons that we need to contend with in ensuring that people have connectivity during times of crisis and conflict. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lama. And I believe that our Zoom participants can hear now if they use not original audio, but if they go to one of the language tracks. So audio works in English, and you can also select captioning to those of you who are online by clicking on More at the bottom of your Zoom screen and selecting captions. And Nadeem, can you tell us a little bit more about the very specific context? And I know Hamle has done research on this, on the impact of the destruction of telecommunications infrastructure in Gaza, and what that is doing to people.
Hi everybody, I'm not sure if you are hearing me or not because there are issues with the audio. You're hearing me? Okay,
we can hear you.
So thank you everybody for having us today and having the possibility to speak and to be part of this event. I am here also and was asked to speak also about the current situation specifically in Gaza and basically regarding the destruction of the infrastructure, the telecom infrastructure, as it was mentioned before. But I think it's important also to go a little bit back in this, because the infrastructure in Gaza has been held captive and controlled by the Israeli occupation since 1967, right? So the occupation, the Israeli occupation controlled the telecom, the Palestinian telecom infrastructure since the occupation of 1967, and since then basically it's a kind of a hostage infrastructure that we're not allowed to perform, to progress. Historically, also, when Oslo agreements were signed by the Palestinian Authority and Israel, it was agreed basically that this arrangement will develop into a Palestinian telecommunication industry or sector that will be independent finally, as there will be independent Palestinian state. I'm talking now about early 90s, 93, 94, with the Oslo agreements, with Paris Accords. All of these agreements that happened at that time never were realized. And until today, as we know, I mean, obviously there was no Palestinian independent state, and the telecom infrastructure is yet to be controlled by the Israeli side, which means basically that all the components of the Palestinian telecom, whether it would be for cell towers or for other components, has to get like approval by the Israeli side, right? And for many years, and for economic reasons, and for assuming that also Palestinian users would prefer Israeli telecommunication companies rather Palestinian ones, they prevented the Palestinian telecommunication sector from developing. So that sector was held captive, but we also need to remember that also there is no independent in the sense of being connected with the world. All the infrastructure basically goes through the Israeli side, right? And the Israeli side is giving the Palestinian side the access to the worldwide internet. And simply as they have the access, they can also cut the access. And this is basically what happened in Gaza. So during the war, during the genocide that is happening in Gaza, it's not only about destruction of the infrastructure that Israel did, and deliberate attacks on the infrastructure, on the cell towers. It also performed at least 17 times of deliberate shutdown, total shutdown of the whole internet and telecommunication of the Palestinians in Gaza. Now, in our research, in our last research that we published in Hamle, we basically speak about an infrastructure that the assumption or the estimate is basically 75%. At that time, we're speaking about a research that was done in summer this year, that 75% of the infrastructure was damaged and 50% of the telecommunication infrastructure was totally destroyed. That does not exist. We assume that since then the level of destruction is even much worse. So this is where we at now. We at a situation where there's a whole destruction of the telecommunication, and we know the impact. I mean, the humanitarian impact. How connectivity is a lifeline in the crisis. How families cannot call their loved one to make sure that they are okay. They cannot call for hospitals for help. Even people who were under the rubble and need some time to call when they are in that situation for help, they cannot do this. So you can imagine how much this is a devastating situation, that people cannot call for any kind of help, cannot communicate with their families in times of crisis, in times where this communication is most needed. I think it's important really to think about what's happening on the broader context, because if this is being a president, and in wartime countries and governments like the Israeli government can do this, this probably will be repeated in other places, because I think many things and many borders and limits that we were used to be respected in the international law, in the international humanitarian law, are being broke by Israel and violated by the Israeli government. I think we also need to think what's the impact globally on other wars, on other conflict zones when such things happen in the future, and why collectively we need to think about mechanisms, how we can stop that, how we can prevent this, their situation from happening in other places. I think for Gazans, there's a need for obviously for ceasefire, to stop the attack, to stop the genocide, to stop the war. But beyond that, there are immediate solutions that need to be given to Gazans in order to overcome the right now situation, specifically when we speak about emergency people, specifically when we speak about journalists and media people who need the connection. So eSIMs was and still one of the solutions, and there are other technical solutions that the telecom company, the Palestinian company, is speaking about like cells on wheels and other kind of technical solution. But obviously, there is a need for long-term solution, and I think it's really important to emphasize when we speak about the future and hopefully the day after, when there will be ceasefire, that there will be a reconstruction of the Palestinian telecommunications sector, that this telecommunications sector will get the newest technologies in order to move on. One thing that I did not mention at the beginning, that we're speaking about the telecom infrastructure in Gaza that was destroyed, but this telecom infrastructure that was destroyed, we are talking about second generation, right? I think Gaza before the war was one of the last places on the globe having only second generation. So the need now is basically that the international community will put enough pressure that there will be a construction after the ceasefire also on the telecom, and that Israel will allow the newest technology to enter Gaza, to be rebuilt, and to make sure that the people there are reconnecting, and there's a long-term solution happening there. Again, I think many people spoke about Palestine, what was happening in Palestine as one big laboratory in terms of surveillance, in terms of infrastructure, but what's happening there is really something that is impacting globally. It's not only a Palestinian problem. Lots of the impact there, lots of the precedent that's happening in Gaza, unfortunately, we will see them in other places if we don't put the right mechanisms to stop that and to have enough pressure on Israel to stop the war on their side. Thank you for having me.
Thanks very much, Nadeem, for that. And Peter, I've been kind of kicked out of the Zoom, or my Zoom is frozen, so I'm relying on you to watch what happens online. I mean, we've talked about shutouts, we've talked about the destruction of infrastructure. I'm not sure, Lama, I was so busy with the tech issues, if you mentioned sanctions, because I think that's another form of excluding people, such as in the case of Sudan, which has been not just impacted by war and conflict, but also for a long time by sanctions, which has made people not able to access certain applications and services. But Sharif, I wanted you to talk about climate change and specifically the situation of small island developing states who are incredibly vulnerable to cyclones, to other forms of disruptions, tsunamis. How does that kind of, when you have one fiber optic cable link, how does that affect people if it's disrupted?
Thank you. Well, let me start by thanking IGF for giving us this opportunity. Small island states, island nations, our connectivity to the rest of the world is really primarily these days with submarine cables. So if you take the case of the Maldives, we have a few submarine cables landing in the Maldives. Two of them connect us to India and Sri Lanka, and we have 3 more cables that we are working on connecting us directly to the Southeast Asia and all the way up to Europe. But also hundreds of small island communities connected by domestic submarine cables, hundreds and hundreds of kilometers from north of south in the ocean. Now we depend on this as a nation today for everything, especially when things go wrong. In crisis, we depend on connectivity even more than usual. So we talk about natural hazards as opposed to natural disasters, because we as humans have a bigger part to play in the disaster or the crisis than nature itself. Nature gives us the hazards like earthquakes or tsunamis. But today with climate change, the frequency and the power of these events actually pose significant threat, which means these submarine cables that come onto our islands face threats from erosion of the beaches and the power of tidal waves right? Plus, we don't have the capacity to go and repair this as developing nations. So we definitely need to invest in our own submarine cable laying and repair capabilities, including these extremely expensive vessels. So today, climate change is a new front that is opening up to us. And actually studies show that the long-term impact of sea level rise will have a much more and very significant effect as more and more of coastal areas get washed into the sea. We may have to redeploy all these landing points, maybe even 20, 30 kilometers inland, but we don't have 20, 30 kilometers in small islands to move this. So yeah, definitely it is extremely important for us that critical infrastructure protection becomes part of the COP series, and funding goes into developing alternatives. So in the Maldives, we are one of the first countries in South Asia to connect with Starlink. And there are other alternatives that maybe in the next round we'll talk about. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Sharif. Let's talk a little bit now about what the normative framework is that exists. Unfortunately, Madeleine Carr cannot join us. She's having an issue with her registration. But we have Ambassador Norman and Lama, you as well. But starting with you, Ambassador, you are part of, the Dutch government is currently chairing the Freedom Online Coalition. I know this is an issue that you have looked at. And also the Netherlands introduced this idea of the norm to protect the public core of the internet. What do you feel we have within this multi-stakeholder community from a normative framework that gives guidelines? There's also what came out of the group of governmental experts as well about, well, the norm of the public core, I think, is very clear. It says that no state or non-state actor should interfere with the public core of the internet. And it says then explicitly, it defines that public core as including transmission media, naming and numbering systems as critical internet resources. But from your perspective, what do we have from a normative, at the level of normative frameworks?
Thank you very much for also mentioning the public core, which was indeed a concept introduced by the Netherlands in 2015. But actually I also have to talk about the UN, because we talk a lot right now also in the so-called open-ended working group in the UN about the implementation of norms. It is actually already some years ago that the UN, or all the states, have established several non-binding norms on the responsible state behavior in cyberspace. And these 11 norms have been endorsed by the General Assembly and are part of a framework of the responsible state's behavior in cyberspace. And this framework also refers to the core internet infrastructure. Let me explain how. Indeed, these 3 norms have to do with critical infrastructure. First, it states that states should not conduct or knowingly support ICT activity contrary to its obligations under international law that intentionally damages critical infrastructure. And second, provides that states should take appropriate measures to protect their critical infrastructure. And according to the third norm, states should respond to appropriate requests for assistance by another state whose critical infrastructure is subject to malicious ICT acts. Now, what's interesting is that while norms provide that it's up to states to designate their national critical infrastructure, which is kind of logic, like the Netherlands, for us, the port of Rotterdam is critical, while for Switzerland, a port is of less importance. So yeah, it depends really on the country itself, but they do include, as examples of critical infrastructure, the technical infrastructure essential to the general availability or integrity of the internet. And while these norms are non-binding, they do articulate a clear expectation by the international community with regard to the behavior of states. And for the normative framework to be valuable, it needs to be implemented effectively. An effective implementation means complementary initiatives and enhance each organization and stakeholders to support the resilience of critical infrastructure, also in time of conflict. Now, as you also talk about the role of the technical community, part of the also part of the FOC, by the way, the Freedom Online Coalition. Of course, these organizations in charge of the functioning of the internet have a role in ensuring a resilient infrastructure and general availability and the integrity of the internet. Now, who should better understand what is needed other than these organizations? And let me talk briefly also about the role of the ITU. I believe that there's an important role for the ITU in coordinating responses, which is probably a lesser known function of the ITU. They do important work in disaster relief, but also in crises such as in Ukraine and Gaza. And we need collective expertise in ITU to assist in repairing and ultimately rebuilding the damaged infrastructure. In that sense, we also have to plan ahead. And my neighbor already talked a lot about the submarine cables and the importance. And I was just recently appointed as a member of the new International Advisory Body for Submarine Cable Resilience. And this new 40-member body brings together a lot of expertise from different disciplines. And I hope that we can contribute as an advisory body and in further thinking on ensuring how submarine cables can be protected, how it can become more resilient, and how we can quicker repair also in case of malfunctioning or damaging the damaged cables. Because as was already explained, how crucial they have become part of our internet infrastructure. Now, most importantly also with technical organizations such as the ITU, but also ICANN and RIPE NCC and other regional organizations need to remain neutral for them to be able to function effectively. They also mean for all of us that we need to protect them, so they can do their important work as they have to do. It also means that we should show some restraint in asking these organizations to intervene via the operations in functioning of the public core of the internet or the global digital networks that carry out data. So you talk about sanctions, but on this level we say you should leave them do their neutral work to protect the core of the internet, to make sure that indeed human rights workers, activists, journalists, healthcare workers can keep working on and using the internet. Thank you.
Thanks, Ambassador Dome. And you actually make it sound so clear and simple, and yet we know in practice it's not. But Lama, are there human rights norms and international human rights law that applies in these contexts?
Thank you. And in parallel to the normative frameworks that the ambassador clearly laid out, we have also the legal frameworks of international human rights law and humanitarian law. And under international human rights law, governments have an obligation to ensure that internet-based restrictions and attacks on infrastructure are both necessary and proportionate to a very specific security concern. General shutdowns and attacks on infrastructure violate multiple rights, including the rights to freedom of expression and information, and hinder other rights, like the right to freedom of assembly. In their 2015 joint declaration on freedom of expression and responses to conflict situations, United Nations experts and rapporteurs declared that even in times of conflict, using communications kill switches can never be justified under human rights law. Multiple UN resolutions have condemned intentional disruption of internet access, and they call on states to refrain from carrying them out, including during conflict. And now when it comes to the laws of war, while computer network attacks or cyber warfare are not specifically addressed in the Geneva Conventions, the basic principles and rules on the methods and means of warfare remain applicable. That means that attacks must be targeted against military objectives. They can neither be indiscriminate nor disproportionate. So for example, an attack on an electrical grid that causes long-term harm for the civilian population is likely to be unlawfully disproportionate, whether carried out by airstrikes or cyber warfare. The principle of necessity under human rights law permits measures that accomplish a legitimate military objective that are not otherwise prohibited by international humanitarian law. But shutting down the internet may serve a legitimate military purpose, such as denying belligerent forces a means of communication. However, the principle of proportionality prohibits actions in which the expected civilian harm is excessive in relation to the military advantage. And we know that internet and phone shutdowns and attacks on critical infrastructure can cause considerable harm to the civilian population, including leading to death and injury by preventing civilians from communicating with each other around safety considerations, limiting them from being able to access medical facilities and sources of food and shelter. They also hinder the work of journalists and human rights monitors who can provide information on the situation on the ground, including reporting of possible laws of wars violations. And importantly, the restrictions hamper the ability of humanitarian agencies to assess and provide assistance to populations at risk. The lack of information regarding the conditions and circumstances facing the affected population may also increase the likelihood of injury and death. And I think this is very acute in the case of Gaza, which Nadim has also laid out for us. A complete shutdown of internet and phone communications to large areas can also amount to a form of collective punishment by imposing penalties on people without a clear legal basis. And with regard to the ITU, Article 34 of the ITU's Constitution on the stoppage of telecommunications gives license to ITU member countries to block telecommunications in, quote, which may appear dangerous to the security of the state or contrary to its laws, to public order, or to decency, end quote. While Article 35 on the suspension of services gives member states, quote, the right to suspend the international telecommunication service. These articles have been invoked by some states as granting legal authority to block communications, including to implement internet shutdowns. These provisions must, however, be applied together with and subject to the additional obligations that states have under international human rights law to respect the rights of freedom of expression and other applicable rights. Both the Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Special Rapporteur on the rights of freedom of peaceful assembly and association have called on states to consider revising those provisions in order to align them explicitly with international human rights standards. The Special Rapporteur has also recommended that the ITU issue guidance clarifying that those provisions should never be understood as authorizing internet shutdowns. In a welcome move, the ITU did take the historic step of condemning the communications blackout in Gaza and called for life-saving access to networks to be restored there.
Thanks very much for that, Lama. And I mean, it's actually, I think, really notable that there is an elaborate body of international laws and norms that do apply in these contexts. Before I open it to the audience, I want to ask Peter, Nadim, and our panelists in the room, if you have anything to add before we move on to the next segment, which will be looking at alternatives and responses. But anything to add at this point, or any questions you have for one another? Anyone from the audience with a question? If you have a question, you have to move to the front to the stage. And Peter, if you can solicit comments online, please.
Definitely. We do have comments online talking about the alarming trend of internet shutdowns, including during critical times like protests, elections, and civil unrest. If I could use my prerogative, I would just add that those ITU rules even do require some process, some procedural requirements that states notify the ITU, for example, of the disruptions and the reason for the temporary stoppage and blockage in telecoms. And often these procedural requirements are not followed. And you'll see that even in states that do allow for internet shutdowns under law, that they're often not followed according to procedure. And so there's no notice to the population of the reason, of the duration, the extent of the blocking. And yeah, as a lawyer personally, that has given courts the opportunity to step in and say, you may have this power, but you are not exercising it according to the methods and the protocols set out in law. So just one more aspect.
Ambassador Norman and then Kojo.
Thank you. One point I would like to add, because I didn't go into the Freedom Online Coalition actually, which we are chairing this year. Maybe not all knows about the Freedom Online Coalition, but it's a coalition that exists since 2011. And that is a coalition of countries, including also an advisory network of NGOs, academia, but also the private sector, in how to protect human rights online. And we are chairing this year the Human Rights Coalition, and now we added 4 members this year, and now we are a 42-member coalition. And the objective is to strengthen ourselves also in the discussions at mainly UN level, like now also with the Western +20 process, with the angle of human rights, how to protect the internet, how to protect the open accessibility and operability of the internet. The freedom on the net is an extremely important topic, and also internet shutdowns has been discussed time and again. Also, how to bring it about also in the international discussions to to ensure more responsible behavior of states, as you know, Lama already indicated also in her contribution on the rules which already exist on keeping the communication lines open. We did a lot of effort also in the GDC to ensure a strong language also on the internet shutdowns. We were looking for stronger language, stronger linkage to international law. In the end, that was not part of it, but it was indeed that internet shutdown should be avoided. But we are very much aware as a Freedom Online Coalition, and we have to continue working on that. It's not an issue that's been settled. Actually, the Freedom on the Net report of Freedom House has showed that it has been on the increase, unfortunately. Thank you.
Thanks, Ambassador. Kojo.
Yeah, thanks for the interventions from my esteemed colleagues on the right and the overview from Peter. A couple of things I wanted to point out, in part because I feel like I've been part of this WSIS process since 2005, and along those years I've learned quite a lot from listening to people. I think we broadly use the term internet shutdowns, and there may be some people who are less learned that might think the whole place goes dark. I also want to point out there are partial internet shutdowns that are arguably just as challenging, or if not more so in some cases, especially when you see particular apps or particular parts of the internet which are used for freedom of expression and exercising human rights. I think the other piece that's really important as well, and sometimes we forget about it, and I have to remind people, not that many need reminding, that there are so many people still offline. So Peter's great overview, I think, spoke about 1.1 billion people in abject poverty, and 50% of those people being subject to their infrastructure or whatever being out of place. It's important to remind ourselves that despite the huge effort and impact we've had in connecting people, so many people still remain offline. And actually many of the problems we've spoken about, especially with regard to sustainability and the challenges that come from that, actually amount to people being in abject poverty, not being connected, not being able to get jobs, and actually destroying parts of the ecosystem themselves as a result as they seek to eke out a life. So I just wanted to point that out, but I felt the opening comments were fantastic.
Thanks, Kojo. That's always important for us to acknowledge. We have two speakers from the audience. Introduce yourself and be brief.
Hello, my name is JJ. I come from New York City and I run an internet resilience research firm. This is one of the most robust conversations I've heard from this forum on the concept of shutdowns. And you guys mentioned some really good points. One gentleman, I believe the Dutch ambassador, mentioned eSIMs, and then there was also discussion about COP and energy. My question would be that I've lived through an internet shutdown. I'm from Tigray, and I've experienced what it looks like from a diasporatic perspective to be shut off from your community. So my question would be, if we accept that the internet infrastructure is tied to the power infrastructure, and we accept that eSIMs in Gaza have allowed for still a constant live streaming of the atrocities, then do you feel that as a coalition, the UN and various member states have a duty to their citizens who are from those regions that they've encouraged to emigrate to their countries for various economic benefits and support? Do they have a duty to focus on eSIMs and power infrastructure because their citizens deserve the ability to connect and communicate with their family members in these shutdown regions? And how do you see a coalition that actually focuses on these nation states' duty to their citizens to get involved in these conversations? Thank you.
Thanks, JJ. The next person.
Thank you. My name is Khalid Mansour. I serve on Meta Oversight Board. As Lama made clear, we have enough body of international human rights law to oblige countries not to cut the internet services, especially when there are dire consequences, humanitarian, and not only human rights, but humanitarian and lives of people which are lost. Now, the question is that there is no enforcement or enforceability of this big body of international human rights law, and also states, and rightly so maybe, still have the sovereign right to take decisions using other elements of the international law to justify that. And I guess my question to Lama and maybe to Nadim and others, what would be the way out in light of the lack of enforceable mechanisms, but secondly, in lack of a technical solution that probably will happen in a few years where internet access will not be subject to sovereign authority? Thank you.
Thanks for those questions. Lama, one was directed to you, Nadim, but anyone else want to respond to either of those? Let's start with you, Lama.
Thank you for the easy questions. No, I think issues around compliance with international human rights law are always a challenge. We do need to see enforcement from, other countries. And in the context of internet shutdowns, I mean, these are abuses that often take place in the context of other violations that are also being perpetrated. So the government of Iraq may be imposing an internet shutdown while they are also using excessive force against protesters. And the actions in response to that states can take are varied. And they can include things like targeted sanctions, in some cases stopping providing military assistance, condemnation, but also accountability does need to be a critical component of this, particularly when we're discussing, attacks on infrastructure in the broader context of war crimes that are being perpetrated. And we have seen with the crisis in Gaza that there has been a real crisis in enforcement and ensuring that there are accountability for crimes. But at the same time, there are judicial processes that are moving forward that I think we need to support and invest in, and collectively use our influence with other governments to use their leverage to ensure more rights-respecting practice.
Anyone want to add? Ambassador.
Thank you also for those easy questions. And I felt indeed, as one of the one who asked a question and refers also to coalition, I felt obliged also to react. You know, we're in the field, of course, of diplomacy, and diplomacy means negotiation, but also a lot of dialogue. And enforcement of voluntary norms or international law has always been a challenge. But it doesn't mean we are excluded from the responsibility to really have serious, in-depth consultations with other countries. We, for instance, have, from my side, also cyber consultation with many countries, and especially also in the position of a chair of the Freedom Online Coalition, I always felt it rather actually easy to bring up subjects like human rights online, internet shutdowns, and our concerns if that would happen in a certain country. And then, you know, asking questions what they think about it. And I think also what Lama said, I mean, if there's evidence that the violence goes up after an internet shutdown, that's even a strong argument for governments, and for me then to present those arguments, that is actually counterproductive, such a measure. But it's, in the end, also, you know, in this world, it's complicated. We have different interests, different views on topics. But it's our role as diplomats to try to convince others of well, what we think unjust measures against the civilian population.
Henriette, we have a hand online. Nadim, yeah, can you come on?
Yes, I think the main issue or the main word here is accountability, and it's clearly that there is a lack of accountability to governments and states who are violating, specifically when we speak also about the context of the war in Gaza and the ongoing genocide in Gaza and the Israeli government that is not being held accountable. I think for me as a Palestinian, it's very sad to see the double standard that's happening in this aspect, because the enforcement that happened when the Russians invaded and occupied Ukraine was very clear. It did not include negotiation. There was very clear opposition also from governments, but also from companies, by the way. Companies reacted to that crisis in a very decisive way, in a way that they blocked certain content, allowed certain content. Companies like Starlink and others suggested help and gave help, not in a conditional way. This was totally the opposite when it comes to the Palestinians and when it comes to the Israeli government and how being dealt. And I think this is just, we learn from this that there is double standard in the way that some of the Western companies and some of the Western governments are dealing with the situation. I'm not saying that this should not, it is great that it happened in Ukraine, and it's great that there was a decisive approach. The problem is that this approach does not happen in the global majority countries when there's a tragedy, a conflict, a genocide. I mean, I'm speaking about Palestine, but I can speak about Tigray, I can speak about Myanmar and other places, and how those people who are supposed to be protecting democracy and human rights values and enforcing did not have any clear say or any clear action in those cases.
Thanks, Nadim, for mentioning that. And I think that's one of the issues we want to address in this session. How do we have a more coherent, consistent response, both in terms of international and international humanitarian law, but also from the internet global multi-stakeholder community? Let's now move on did you want to add something there quickly?
Quickly, I feel we didn't respond to JJ's question, and I just wanted to say, I think in some respects, the answer to internet shutdowns has been, the response has been more from private sector engagement in terms of trying to find solutions for people on the ground. And I hear you in what you're saying in terms of what more can states do to ensure that their residents or their citizens are able to maintain connectivity with others and where they're suffering from internet shutdowns. But I do think it's a space where innovative solutions coming from the private sector can really also reinforce what governments are doing to try to keep people connected. And I think, looking at how eSIMs have been used in Gaza, but also thinking about how people have tried to circumvent shutdowns in places like Iran, there needs to be a strong alliance there in terms of thinking through the solutions.
Thanks, Lama. And yes, what responses? Let's move on to this. And Kojo, to start with you, what are the alternatives? How do private sector companies, how can they respond? What are the concrete technical, operational, and policy measures? And I see Peter is just also adding a question here. Can international laws regarding to shutdowns be taken to international courts? I mean, I think, Lama, you implied, yes, we can. But, Kojo, yes, the private sector, how does it respond? And how can it respond in such contexts?
I like to think that our approach and effort to responding is comprehensive, despite some of the challenges that people have outlined, not only in their comments, but also in their questions. I think as you spoke, you asked about policy. So for us as a company, we have founded our work on human rights principles. We have a global human rights policy. We're part of the Global Network Initiative alongside other companies. We have the UN guiding principles on business and human rights as well, that all our work is founded in. And I think having that mainstreamed into the company, not just within policy teams and not those teams that just focus on human rights, but into everything we do in terms of product development as well, is a super important start. And then I think it's about analyzing some of those issues. The short-term shocks we have in terms of total internet shutdowns and partial internet shutdowns that I mentioned, where particular services or parts of the internet are shut down, is something we've been thinking about for a long time. I think Lama just spoke about what do we do when governments, and I think the example was Iran, but we could cite a number of other governments who have sought to shut down the internet, either by destroying infrastructure or in some cases phoning mobile operators and telling them to turn a service off. We can think about how we might continue to deliver services to ensure that people don't remain voiceless. One of the steps we've taken is with WhatsApp, for example, which I think everybody here, I assume, has used. Unfortunately, not being able to make calls here from KSA, hopefully soon, but has used in some way. With WhatsApp, we've built a proxy service to WhatsApp where volunteers and others around the world set up servers to enable people to continue using a version of WhatsApp that enables them in places like Iran to carry on connecting with people, to carry on delivering services and help and sharing information about what's going on. I think that's important. But I think I've also been struck by, over my 8 years with the company, the way we've approached infrastructure. So one of the challenges that a number of people on the panel have mentioned are the challenges we have around infrastructure, certainly submarine cables. This was a vivid example where submarine cables are cut. I am heartened by the fact that our most recent builds, like to Africa, the longest submarine cable in the world, the first to connect east to west, west to east of Africa, however you want to do it, more capacity than all the cables at the moment. I can give you all the talking points, but what I'm heartened by is the fact that we bury that cable more than 50% deeper than other submarine cables or submarine cables are normally buried, in part because we're trying to ensure that the cuts that we have seen and my own family have suffered from in Ghana, and when SAT3 is cut and suddenly the internet's cut off for 5 days as they seek to go through the difficulties of repairing, are avoided. And I think that's a super important part of our comprehensive approach to dealing with things. And then in the midst of crisis, I think there are ways, and I think we've spoken about a range of crises. One, conflict, which obviously we've seen affect infrastructure and services everywhere, but also natural disasters. And I think in those instances, and most recently I can think of earthquakes in Morocco, Turkey, devastating earthquakes everywhere, but certainly more devastating than some we might see in Turkey and Syria. We've been quick to act through working with disaster agencies, sharing data for good with agencies like disaster relief to enable people to be helped in the way those disaster agencies do, and also sharing some of our network insights with some of our private sector partners in the mobile industry. Where is your network damaged most? How should you be routing particular traffic to ensure that people can stay connected? And I think those elements of thinking about how do we approach it from a human rights perspective, policy, and how do we mainstream that into the company? How do we work in the midst of crisis or internet shutdowns as they happen, i.e. the WhatsApp proxy, and then thinking about the future. How do we build networks that are more resilient to the kind of shocks? And then for companies like ours that have a range of data that could be used to support people in crisis, how do we share that in a privacy way, a privacy compliant way, but certainly how do we share that with organizations who are best placed to help? And I think we've done all of that. But there is, for us and many of our competitors, as well as our partners in government and civil society, much more work to do.
Thanks, Gordon. Just a follow-up question on that. Are you engaging in these responses as Meta? Is there a collaborative mechanism of some kind between different private sector corporations?
Yeah, Meta has always been about partnership. The Keep It On initiative that Peter described is not news to us. We've been a key part of that and continue to be. We continue to work with, as I mentioned, NGOs and any other kind of partners. Our infrastructure bills, the cable I mentioned, is built with other industry partners, including MTN, China Mobile, etc. So we will continue to approach it in this way through partnership, and we think that's key.
And then in the context of these current conflicts, the conflict in Gaza, the conflict in the war in Russia and Ukraine, what measures have you taken in the Gaza context, for example?
To outline all of those would take more time than I think my other panelists would allow, but we work with a range of partners looking at that. We've sought to keep voice and expression open when possible. I know there are a number of allegations about what ourselves and many other companies have done, but we have a team dedicated, not only our global human rights team, but also within my team, a community engagement and action team that's dedicated to continue engaging with those on the ground. If I gave you more insights into the work we've done with journalists, and we know how many journalists have been killed in this conflict, and with other organizations on the ground, it would take far too much time. But we are proud of the work we've done, but clearly, as I've said earlier, have much more work to do in this conflict, as you've mentioned, the Ukrainian conflict, and the other conflict that I have to stress we should not forget, the conflict in Sudan at the moment as well, in which more than 12 million people have been displaced, and we continue to work hard on that as well.
And in fact, we have many Sudanese participants here at the IGF, so it's good to hear from them as well. Cynthia, I want to turn to you, because I think one of the most significant responses, at least from the intergovernmental sector, has been the ITU Council resolution on assistance to Palestine in restoring infrastructure. And I think it's been very significant that certainly from where I look at this issue, we've probably had a more public and a more deliberate response from the intergovernmental community than from the multi-stakeholder community, which I think is a challenge to the IGF. But tell us a bit about that resolution, how it came about, and how you see it having an impact.
Thank you, and I also want to take this opportunity to thank the organizers to give us this opportunity to come and speak here. Perhaps the first thing that one would want to highlight in terms of the role of the ITU in as far as the issue of Palestine is concerned is to firstly look at the preamble of the ITU Constitution, which is quite clear in terms of the increasing significance of the telecommunication in supporting the economic and social development of all nations. And the convention of the ITU goes further to state that its objective is to facilitate the development of telecommunication services and also to provide the widespread benefit of new telecommunication technologies for all people around the globe. And earlier on, we heard about the persisting digital divide that the world continues to experience. And maybe just to give specific numbers in terms of what the ITU has published to date in terms of the people who are online, we have about 5.5 billion people who are online, which then would give us an estimate of about 68% of the global population online. However, this does not mean that our problems are over, and I'm talking from the point of view of ITU, is that the digital divide persists to really haunt us as the governments in the ITU. And having said that, you mentioned that the ITU has been, adopted a resolution, a council resolution, but perhaps there's a need to also mention that before the adoption of the council resolution this year in 2024, the ITU have actually adopted a number of resolutions to assist the rebuilding of the telecommunication infrastructure in countries which are in need. For instance, there's a plenipotentiary conference which the ITU adopted, which is Resolution 125, which, among others, is calling for a framework of activities by the three sectors of the ITU to continue and enhance in order to provide the assistance and the support to Palestine for building and developing its telecommunication infrastructure. And it is also, that resolution is also calling to enable Palestine to urgently extend and install and own and manage its own fiber and broadband telecommunication networks, and including fiber optics links between governments and major states. But in addition to that, there's another plenipotentiary resolution that the ITU has adopted, which is on assisting and supporting countries in special need for building their telecommunications sector. And that resolution in particular, it resolves that the special action undertaken by the General Secretary of the ITU and the Director of the Development Bureau, with special assistance from the Radio Communication Bureau of the ITU and the standardization sector, should continue to be activated in order to provide appropriate assistance and support to countries in special need. Referred to, there is an annexure to that resolution which lists all the countries that needs assistance in terms of rebuilding their telecommunication infrastructure. But again, there's as you've said, the ITU recently in its council of 2024 adopted the ITU Council resolution, which is a new resolution in addition to what I've mentioned. And the resolution, it is actually calling for continue assisting in the monitoring and providing regular reports on particular needs of Palestine in the field of telecommunication, and to prepare proposal for effective technical assistance. And among other things, that resolution resolves to direct or to instruct the directors of the three sectors of the ITU to particularly to monitor and provide regular reports on particular needs of the Palestine in the field of telecommunication, and to prepare proposals for effective technical assistance. And in addition to that, to carry out the assessment on the impact of the war in Palestine on ITU programs and activities in the region, and to provide the report to the Council. And thirdly, that resolution calls to ensure adequate financial and human resource mobilization, including under the budget of the ITU and the Information Communication Technology Development Fund, for the implementation of the actions that are proposed by the number of ITU resolutions. And with this, it is quite clear that the ITU is really, and its members, is trying to put together the resolutions that are guiding its membership to ensure that the problems that are currently experienced in Gaza and any other country as a result of the devastating wars and the conflict that are happening in the world, the ITU is actually putting in place measures and procedures to ensure that those countries, they rebuild their telecommunication infrastructure. And I think I'll stop at this. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for that, Cynthia. And you know, I think it's also worth us looking and sharing if there are people in the audience or online from the internet technical community that have engaged in similar initiatives to respond and assist, to share that as well. Because I would assume also, Cynthia, that implementing that resolution will require collaboration. Not, you know, ITU member states are not going to be able to do that on their own. They'd have to work with the private sector, they'd have to work with national ministries, civil society, and the technical community. But I want to hand over to Peter here. My battery is also running out. Any comments online that we should share, or any questions you have? Before we go into our final segment, which is looking at what can this community do to help get us to a more concrete place of securing access and infrastructure.
Thank you so much. I do want to follow up on that great presentation of the work at the International Telecommunication Union. It's really been remarkable and heartening to see that really swift action across the ITU in response to the conflict and the war in Gaza, and as you say, coming out with coordination programs that are applicable across many situations of conflict and crisis. So building on that, I wanted to ask what coordination should we expect from humanitarian and aid agencies to provide populations they serve with access to the internet or to secure and open communications tools. Now, I know, in Sudan, for example, those agencies have trouble fulfilling their missions of accessing people in need, and in those places, there are citizen-led mutual aid groups standing up to play a role in ensuring access. While in Gaza, as we've heard, there are restrictions on the transfer of telecoms hardware and assets to those in need. So what can we expect and what should we expect from these aid agencies?
Anyone wanting to respond to that? Cynthia, Lama? Kojo, did you not hear the question? The question is, what response from the international humanitarian agencies? Is that right, Peter? You can repeat the question.
Okay. Sure. So I was noting that in places like Sudan, humanitarian aid agencies are having trouble accessing the populations in need, and their mutual aid groups have played a role in providing access to the internet. In Gaza, there are restrictions on transferring telecoms hardware to populations in need. In these situations, what should we expect of humanitarian and aid agencies and to fulfill their mission of protection of civilians and the provision of aid? Should we expect them to provide access to the internet and secure telecoms?
I would say, I think some of them try to do that. I think the International Red Cross and Red Crescent does try to do that. I think, can they do it alone? I think that is very, very difficult for them to do. I think they recognize that they need to do that, but it's extremely difficult for them to do that. And not all of them have the capacity to do that. But Cynthia, I see you wanted to add there.
Yes, and thank you. Earlier on, you said that, in terms of the implementation of some of the resolutions that the ITU have adopted, it's not easy to implement them. And you are quite correct. It's not easy at all. And you pointed out to the continuation of the multi-stakeholder approach in terms of implementing some of this. And now talking from the ITU perspective and trying to respond to the question is that I think from the ITU, as Ambassador has mentioned before, we are operating in it's a diplomatic environment, and the decisions that we take are based on consensus-based. And, the continuous deliberation is quite important. So for the ITU, if I were to talk from that perspective, we believe in continuous facilitation of cross-stakeholder dialogue towards co-creating and aligning around common agenda for action and advocacy regarding the non-fragmentation of the internet infrastructure during conflict. And from where we are standing as ITU member states is that this will ensure combining and leveraging the complementary roles and diverse capabilities of larger stakeholders and promote their inclusive participation in protecting the internet infrastructure. Thank you.
Thanks, Cynthia. Lama, you want to add?
Just briefly also, to respond, Peter, to your question, I think, governments have an obligation to facilitate deliveries of humanitarian assistance. And when they are encumbering internet access, they are encumbering those operations in unlawful ways. And I think there will be humanitarian agencies that do seek to provide connectivity for their staff and in the communities where they're operating so that they can deliver on their mission. It's not their obligation to do so. And I think what can help is the monitoring of the impact that the lack of connectivity also has on the delivery of assistance, because that also helps to underline where the government is also not adhering to its obligations under the law.
Yeah, everything that Lama said, and then I think it's not, I asked for a repeat of the question, but very mindful that it doesn't feel like my place to call on humanitarian agencies to do much more than we at Meta see them doing already. We've supplied ad credits to a number of humanitarian agencies working on all the conflicts that you've mentioned and more. WhatsApp has become a key tool for many humanitarian agencies, and we see the effort they go to. I think some of the comments that have been made about the breakdown of the response and of the international community to many of these crises probably highlight some of the challenges they face. And it would be great to have someone from that particular community, the disaster agency response community, on this panel to speak to it. But thanks for repeating the question.
In fact, we did have real interest from Philippe Stoll from the Red Cross to be here, but he was not able to participate. They actually do very significant work in this field. I see there's a question. I don't know if there are online hands, Peter, but I see two people. Please go ahead briefly, introduce yourself and ask your question.
Thank you. My name is Michel Lambert. I'm working with a Canadian organization called Equality. We are dedicated to build alternative technology, particularly to respond to internet shutdowns, network disruption. And we also manage the SplinterCon process. I hope most of you know it. The SplinterCon process is gathering every meeting like hundreds of people with new technologies, particularly to respond to those situations. The last edition was last week in Berlin. My comment is, we have all kinds of technologies and they're working well, working not well, but globally speaking, we are not having access to the resource to implement them properly, as the political side or the big private sector is struggling to find ways, to respond to the issues. We're not having really, we could play a role there, but we still maintaining some sort of the margin, we just have some sort of resource to small project. It's looking nice, it's fun, but then at the end of the day, we're not responding to the crisis to the level that we could eventually do it. So I feel that's a bit of a lost opportunity that the world is having here, and that we could engage more, particularly in protracted crisis, where we know that tomorrow there'll be another situation and we still are not engaging enough to use the resource that we have. So it's a call. We are here, that community is here. It's an alternative to response, and we could eventually contribute more if there would be some means to engage with us. Thank you.
Thanks, Michel. And I think we're going to come back to how this community can respond soon. The next speaker, please.
Yes, hi everyone. My name's Mike Walton. I'm from the United Nations Refugee Agency. I just want to flag up the Connectivity for Refugees project that we work on, and that is truly a multi-stakeholder approach in working with ITU, GSMA, and many governments on this. So connectivity in crisis is critical. As soon as they're connected, then information is critical. We have 14 million refugees visiting our help websites. Without that access, they would not be able to have access to that information. But I also want to flag up that as soon as those connectivity and those communication channels are up, they can also be the subject of misuse. And across the multiple languages and the multiple platforms that exist, it's a question to the panel, how can we make sure that we can moderate and we can ensure content policies are properly policed or managed when there are so many different languages and so many different capacities in place? And what's the balance between the people role in this and what's the balance between the AI role in that, if there is one at all? Thank you.
Thanks for that. We actually fairly deliberately did not want to delve into content moderation because it is in itself such a challenging issue. But I'm going to let Peter take over from me right now. And I see Nadeem has his hand up.
Yes, just before there's some comments in the chat about also an initiative in Ukraine of operators trying to provide hardware and support to keep the internet working. There's also concern about states asserting kind of sovereignty and sovereign rights and to push back against, I think, efforts to serve populations in their states. So yeah, Nadeem, please take it away.
Thank you, Peter. I just wanted to add something. I know that you, Henriette, said you don't want to get into content moderation, but just to say that it's important also to speak about access on platforms, access that is responsibility of the companies, because we are speaking about physical infrastructure and to get the access through them. But what would happen if you do have the internet access, but the platform is deplatforming you or preventing you from using it? And we saw this in social media platforms, including Meta, that is deplatforming and restricting accounts during the war in Palestine and in other places, not allowing newsworthiness, not allowing journalists to do their job, not allowing also human rights defenders to document the violations that are happening on the ground. But this is not only social media issue, this is also a payment platform, digital payment platforms. We know that PayPal, for example, a major one, is not allowing certain countries to use its platform, and this is very problematic. We know that there are crowdfunding platforms that have been deplatforming certain people when they try to make donations for Gaza or for other places. So just to say that it's not only about the infrastructure, we need also to speak about the access that people have or do not have, from which countries, especially when it comes to the global majority, that they are either not allowed to use this platform, or they are, even when they are on the platform, they are being deplatformed. And I think this is also an important issue to deal
with. Peter, anyone online that wants to respond? Anyone here that wants to respond?
I think this gets at the fragmentation discussions a bit that we've seen at previous internet governance forums.
And also, the IGF has the policy network on internet fragmentation, which I think has one of the aspects of their work that I think is very significant, is their highlighting of the fragmentation of user experience, which is something we can't underestimate. Any of the panelists want to add anything before we go into our what next segment? Any other questions from the room? I saw a comment earlier in the Zoom, while I was still in the Zoom, with someone expressing concern that there's also harmful use of infrastructure, or infrastructure can be used, or internet infrastructure can be used by people with bad intentions. I think that's actually an important point, but I want to come back because I think Lama covered that. And I was part of the Global Stability Commission, or Global Stability of Global Commission Stability of Cyberstates, who worked with the public core norm. And our conclusion is that when it comes to the internet, it's very difficult to isolate what part of that infrastructure is being used by hospitals, by aid workers, as opposed to what's being used by bad actors. And I think your point, Lama, about proportionality is very, very relevant here. And I think this notion that it's legitimate to disrupt or destroy internet infrastructure because bad actors are using it, I think illustrates how disproportional a response that is. But I think there was Peter, am I right? There was a comment to that effect in the chat.
Yes, definitely that, under the guise of protecting internet infrastructure, states could be, protecting combatants or, protecting their own, sovereignty in ways that are ultimately harmful or malicious even.
Well, let's move on, if nobody is going to add anything. I think I also just want to recognize that we have probably not done justice to the range of responses and alternatives and solutions that are being developed by businesses, by civil society organizations, relief organizations, activists, national governments, local governments. I think there is a lot happening also in the internet technical community, but I think it's very fragmented and it's very hard for us, I think, to see those responses connect to normative frameworks and application and compliance of international law and of voluntary norms. But let's now think about the internet governance, multi-stakeholder community that comes together here at the IGF. And panelists, what do you think this community should be done? I think you all made it quite clear that the gap is not really at the level of norms. Or is there a gap at norms, if you want to highlight that? What do you think the IGF can do and participants in the IGF community, from the internet technical community, as well as from governments, from the UN system and civil society? What can we do to prevent what seems to be very ad hoc responses to these types of disruptions and destructions? Ad hoc, characterized by double standards, often too late, too little. So I'm going, Koja, you look like you have something to say, so I'm going to start with you.
I was trying to capture the question in terms of what we can do as a multi-stakeholder group or as individuals.
I think you're very welcome to talk about what you can do as individuals or individual companies, but I think what we want to get at is a more structured intervention, a more coherent intervention which can galvanize the diversity of role players and actors that we have in this forum, and that can create more compliance, more consistency, more coherence, and ultimately that can ensure that people have access to the internet in context of conflict and crisis.
No, so I think that's helpful. I think, look, having sat on this panel and learned from others coming in and previously, I think this diversity that you speak about is beautiful in many ways, but also creates some challenges in understanding exactly what different parties and indeed the multi-stakeholder group might do. And I think conversations like this are very, very helpful, but capturing the ways in which companies, civil society organizations, governments, international organizations, etc., are working toward this would be the first step. And to be frank, and because I'm a simple man, and we like to simplify things sometimes in order to get them done, carving away some of the things that that drive that diversity, if that makes sense. I think there are a myriad of things, and that can create some confusion and ambiguity over exactly what we might do. And I think clarity over what works, and I know that will, there are infinite things that work, but clarity over what works, what's optimal and works would be really, really important. And whether that's under the guise of the IGF, which I think continues to be a super important platform under the guise of the ITU or the UN itself. I'm not, it's above my pay grade to answer that particular question.
Thanks, Gorjo. Ambassador.
I'm not sure it's my pay grade, but I will go into the UN part also. You know, the discussions on norms are incredibly difficult and challenging, and that, of course, geopolitics is in play with the subjects in all discussions. But now we have a set of norms which are non-legally binding, but they are based on and complement international law. So we have recognized that international law applies in cyberspace. This means that we have some legally binding obligations under the Charter, but also under international humanitarian law and human rights law. So what we need now is not new norms, as some countries are suggesting, but we have to make sure that the 11 norms we have endorsed are now also being implemented. And to ensure implementation is efficient, we need the engagement of all stakeholders. This means, of course, a role for the UN agencies and the technical community, as well as the private sector, civil society, and academia. And next year, the open-ended working group will end its mandate, and we hope that it will be followed by an action-oriented mechanism, allowing for constructive and active participation of stakeholders, and with the so-called program of action. So our focus right now should be on implementation. The implementation should not only be multi-stakeholder, but also multidisciplinary and multi-sectoral. And we also need to develop a common understanding how international law applies. And we have welcomed the resolution adopted recently at the conference of the ICRC that provides further elements on the application of international humanitarian law in the context of the use of ICTs. And we should work hard on capacity building. And that's also something we cannot do alone as states. We have to do that all together. This means this is the basis for greater implementation of the normative framework, and we can leave no one behind, and growing expertise on cyber is crucial. We always say, cybersecurity and cyberspace is teamwork. We have to work to do that together, to make it resilient and to keep it open and free and accessible. Maybe a nice example how we also do the capacity building at the UN level is the Women in Cyber program, where we, together with a number of countries, we have meanwhile trained about 47 women from countries who were not actively participating in the discussion in New York. And now we have trained 47 women, and they are actively at the table, well trained, with good contribution, which means that not only the female voices heard, in 2023 more than 50% of the contribution were from women, but that also countries who were previously not involved, didn't really understand the discussions, are now completely involved and understand the topics and play an important role. So in that sense, I think it's a common and shared responsibility also to make sure that everyone has a capacity, and that's also a multi-stakeholder involvement, which is one of the main topics at the IGF here today. Thank you.
Thanks, Ambassador. At least part of what you said sounds like something that an Internet Governance Forum, best practice forum, or one of the intersessional modalities in the IGF could actually look at. My organization was very involved in a best practice forum on online gender-based violence about 6, 7, 8 years ago, and it really helped map how responses can take place without compromising human rights. But Sharif, what do you think can be done?
From the perspective of climate change, extreme weather, and in the context of small island nations, I think IGF, particularly the specialized dynamic coalitions within the IGF, could actually play a bigger role in supporting the island nations take the case of making resilient digital development in these small islands to the COP series and support these nations in securing funds for digital resilience. Enhance, bridge the gap between technology, multi-stakeholder technology efforts going on here, and multi-stakeholder environmental discussions, and how the developed world can support the developing nations with the challenges they are facing with respect to man-made climate change and the result that we are talking about, disruption to internet. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sharif. Lama.
Thank you. I think we need to stigmatize internet shutdowns so that it is the act of a pariah state to shut down the internet. The internet is so intertwined in our ability to realize our rights that undermining connectivity is, so abhorrent that states in good standing do not exercise this kind of behavior. And I think we do that by enforcing the normative framework with things like the Keep It On campaign, which Access Now has spearheaded. And we do work collectively to minimize the effectiveness of attempts to shut down the internet. And I think a lot of the initiatives there have been generated from the private sector, and we can think through more of what are ways to undermine governments who are trying to do this. And there's a role here also for internet service providers, because it's the governments that dictate the blackouts, as internet service providers that are actually implementing them. And what more can they do to push back against these requests, to interpret them narrowly? Is there scope under domestic law to file lawsuits in response to these demands? Businesses also do have responsibilities under the guiding principles, the UN guiding principles, businesses and human rights, which should anchor them in thinking about how to respond to these requests, which can be far-reaching and also have far-reaching consequences on human rights.
Thanks for that, Lama. Peter, there's a comment online.
Yes, just a very practical proposal for a project to fund and operate a mini fleet of UN cable laying ships. So it's very expensive to lay these submarine cables and very expensive to operate the ships that repair them. But to help LDCs and developing countries, especially after climate crises, to get faster service, maybe a little UN cable keeping force.
Yeah, a rapid response.
Yeah.
Kojo, yes. And by the way, I didn't buy that comment about the simple man. Not for a minute, by the way. So I'm going to give you the mic again.
I was trying to sell it. No, I just wanted to add to what Lama said about stigmatizing.
Microphone.
I'm so sorry. Should always remember the microphone. No, I just wanted to add to what Lama was saying about stigmatize, which I think is super important. And I just had a quick chat with her off camera or offline, and we spoke about the need to penalize as well. And I think one of the things that we've found really helpful in our engagements with those governments who have either decided to do full internet shutdowns or partial internet shutdowns of things like Instagram and Facebook is the actual cost to the economy. And actually, when all of us are well tuned with speaking with policymakers, it boils down to costs and benefits, many of their decisions. And some of the decisions some of the things we've spoken about here today have boiled down to a government or a regime or whomever assuming, will this enable me to stay in power or not? Others, it's, an economic cost or whatever else. And actually pointing out the cost and letting that information become part of their calculus of this cost-benefit analysis is so important. So I align with Lama on stigmatize where possible, penalize, but really that engagement and ensuring that governments understand the cost is really important. And the fact that in many countries the digital economy is the economy now, it underpins everything, has become helpful in that.
It's absolutely true, but I also can, having worked to oppose and counter shutdowns, sometimes governments that shut down the internet is very much aware of the cost. That does not stop them.
And that's what I meant. Sometimes you're not going to get around a government who believe this is the only way I'm going to maintain national security or stay in power. But increasingly, you want that information to be part of their calculus, and I think that's really, really important.
Cynthia.
Yes, thank you. I'm just thinking aloud as I'm sitting here and listening to my fellow panelists.
A little bit closer to the mic,
yes,
I think.
I'm sitting here and thinking as I'm listening to my fellow panelists, trying to answer the question that you have asked. And I'm saying to myself, perhaps we, as the Internet Governance Forum community, we have a good opportunity in front of us. I mean, next year, we're talking about the WSIS Plus 20 review process. And some of these ideas that are being shared here, perhaps there is a need for us to consider highlighting them or reflecting them in the WSIS Plus 20 review process, and just to make them more visible and try and solve some of the challenges that we spoke about here. So I think that's what I thought we should consider as the IGF community to consider things.
Thanks very much for that. Very relevant remarks, Cynthia. Nadeem.
Yes, I think, obviously as a civil society organization, we are limited with our capacity and what we can do, but I think it's important to keep our work in terms of the research, in terms of documenting the violations that are happening there, also from the side of governments, but also from the side of companies, and to make sure that there is at least a process of accountability and that there is publicity to those violations that are happening. But beyond that, I think it's also important for us as civil society, especially ones who are in the humanitarian field, to give the needed assistance that's possible in terms of eSIMs, like short assistance and other like technical small solutions, maybe that are still in our capacity to help the residents, especially when we speak about segments of the population like journalists, media people, first responders and others who their work is urgent, and it's important to keep them online, to keep them connected with the rest of the world.
Thanks, Nadeem. Peter.
Thank you. The chat, again, is getting very technical and concrete, which is great. There's another suggestion for eSIM infrastructure and community networks that exist on top of a decentralized power grid. So I started by talking about how conflicts, impact access to electricity, and there is a proposal for a fleet of Wi-Fi capable portable batteries charged by mobile solar stations. And so, yeah, just very concrete technical proposals. But if I could use my prerogative and speak a bit to the normative and governance discussions, this has been really rich. I think, again, from our perspective, the best way to preserve civilian telecommunications is to have armed groups and armies respected as non-military in nature. And as the OHCHR recently said, and through our own documentation, we've found the internet is a resource indispensable to the survival of civilian populations. As Lama said, the principles of distinction and proportionality in international humanitarian law apply. The corporate and private sector absolutely plays a role. They're being targeted with partial shutdowns. But they also can at times push back and help circumvent disruptions and even hold governments accountable. We've seen companies file lawsuits against governments for demanding disproportionate disruptions. As we've gathered today at the IGF, it's, I think, a good time to assert if we're going to reach the 2030 agenda and provide internet access in all countries to protect our common digital home, recognize the protected status of the public core, and remind folks that to preserve connectivity in conflict, the responsibility lies first and foremost with the parties to the conflicts themselves. and those parties, perhaps in the environmental and climate realm, accountable for that climate change. This, of course, though, means, as we've heard, we can and must proceed in concert together. We can't see destruction of ICTs normalized as part of conflict, but rather part of the solution, protecting civilians in conflict and preserving access to good, legitimate information sources requires robust connectivity. If I could just put out there what I've heard in terms of a few ways forward, I think the Global Digital Compact did set out good language on internet shutdowns. Perhaps there's a working group to implement that language that could come forth. There could be new best practice forum on this topic at the IGF. I know we'll be convening again soon in Norway in June. The Freedom Online Coalition has spoken and will speak further, I think, about telecommunications access in conflict. And I expect them to continue coordination with those 41 member states. And then on accountability, I think it is incumbent on courts like the International Criminal Court and regional bodies, the OECD, which recently did find against Telecom A1 in Austria for contributing to a shutdown, to find accountability, and even the UN Security Council, I think, should incorporate attention to access to telecommunications and the conflicts that it monitors. So that's enough from me, I think, using my prerogative. But thank you, Andrea.
Thanks very much, Peter. Yes, I think I just want to really add, I mean, Lama said we should stigmatize shutdowns. I would like us to stigmatize violation of international law. You know, I think we've become, as a global community, far too tolerant of the disregarding of international law by some of our member states in the UN community. I really do think there's a role for the IGF in this place, because while I think that the international legal framework might clarify what some of the accountabilities of states are, I think we need to explore what the technical community can do. I think we might see an absence of a technical community voice in these contexts, and that might simply be because they're not clear on exactly what their roles and accountabilities are. And I think that's something that the IGF can explore. And I think Cynthia mentioned WSIS, and there are two concepts that were part of WSIS that I think is very relevant here, and that's international cooperation and digital solidarity. I think if we can use the IGF and use this space to build that solidarity and build that cooperation. We're in an era of, people talk about the digital Cold War. I think that's the work of the IGF, to counteract digital Cold Wars and to build the kind of collaboration across borders and across stakeholder groups to ensure that people have access always, everywhere. So thanks very much to everyone, to the panelists, and thank you to the MAG members, to Lito and Peace and others who assisted with organizing this session, to the captioners and the tech team, even though the Zoom was a disaster in the beginning, we forgive you, and to everyone who is here to join in this session. Thank you very much. And a big hand to the panel.
Excuse me, I'm here, I'm just short. I was waiting, sorry. But I think because I'm not tall, sorry. I just want to suggest something. I'm from Sudan, work as a researcher with grassroots movement. From 2018 to 2022, the internet been shut down in Sudan collectively for like up to 4 months. And when the war starts, tomorrow it will be 1 year out of the internet in Sudan. And when the international community talk about the humanitarian aid, especially inside Khartoum or Al Jazeera state, the food plan asks people to apply online. And that's when we say it's not that flexible idea, and you need to talk with the grassroots people and emergency room people to know the solution for this stuff. But how we can ask people to apply online, and there is no internet to have the food aid. The second thing, when it's come to the internet, the RSF can bring the Starlink, and it's equal for 1 hour like $2, just for people to ask for help. I think when the international community can work with the Starlink people or work with the grassroots movement, we can find a solution to help those people to ask for help and this online thing. And yes, I agree with the sanction for 30 years that also affect in our rights as a human being to have an access to ask for help. Thank you.
Thanks, Wayam, for that. In fact, I think we were wanting to talk more about Starlink, and we didn't. But I think it's good that we're closing the session with an example there of perhaps a very uneven response from a private sector operator that can actually make a huge difference and has in some parts of the world, but not everywhere. But we do have to close the session. So thanks again, everyone else, and please have a good IGF. And let's continue the work.
It's on. It's on.